All right. Hi, folks. Welcome to our first virtual lecture. This is kind of weird, I know, but we are just going to roll with it. So I know it's been a long time since we've been in class, or at least it feels like a really long time, at least to me. But you should have been doing the textbook reading and the interactive notepad pages. So you should, being the key word here, you should be feeling like pretty caught up, or like at least like you still know what's going on in the Vietnam War. But just to recap, what we've covered so far in class up until this point was we had looked at the early years of the war, looking at the First Indochina War a little bit, understanding why the Vietnamese wanted their independence, understanding sort of how they did and didn't get it with the partition of Vietnam at the 17th parallel, the 1956 elections that were supposed to happen but then didn't, and then eventually the civil war that starts taking place between North Communist Vietnam and South Capitalist Vietnam, and the United States' ever-increasing role in that conflict. We've talked about the U.S. first providing money, then military advisors, and then, of course, in 1964-65, after the Gulf of Tonkin incident, we saw the real turning point being the escalation of American involvement. So we know that with the Gulf of Tonkin incident, the United States could, or President Johnson, could send troops to Vietnam without having to declare war. We'll be talking a little bit later about why that was so or what sort of ended up happening with all of that. We already know why it's a little bit controversial because he doesn't have to declare war, and that makes it a little bit sketchy. We looked at the pro-war and the anti-war movement, and today we're going to talk about 1968 and it being this real turning point of the Vietnam War. So in looking at the two graphs that we have here, we know that 1968 is a really important year of the war because it is the biggest year of the war in terms of military forces and how many of them there are. You can tell from this graph that 1968 there were significantly more American military forces in Vietnam than there were in any other year, over 500,000 American military forces. And looking at the same graph, it shouldn't surprise you that 1968 also sees the highest number of American military deaths in Vietnam. Almost 17,000 Americans died in Vietnam in 1968. So it's pretty obvious that 68 is a big year. In that other textbook reading that you had been doing in Reading Guide Part 2, they actually identify 1968 as the tumultuous year. It's a really big, important year, and we're going to talk about why. So one of the reasons why 1968 is this crazy year partially has to do with the number of American troops that are there, but also has to do with something called the Tet Offensive. In Vietnam, Tet is the name for their New Year's, and so it's a holiday. And so a lot of people just in general in war see holidays as like, oh, like we're going to take a break from the war. You know, it's sort of an unspoken thing that there'll be maybe like a ceasefire, or just like the battle won't be like the big thing that day because it's a holiday. And so that was generally the expectation across most of South Vietnam. But that was not what North Vietnam had in mind. North Vietnam essentially used the holiday as a way to become, have even more advantages in launching surprise attacks. So on this day in South Vietnam, there were huge North Vietnamese and Viet Cong attacks. So across hundreds of different cities in South Vietnam, you saw either the North Vietnamese military launching attacks, so launching bombing raids and launching like military invasions, and in other parts of South Vietnam, especially in more of the southern part of South Vietnam that is further away from North Vietnam, what you saw were the Viet Cong sort of rising up, launching these large attacks and seizing control of these cities. Eventually, the United States and the South Vietnamese military were able to sort of push these forces back or out and essentially retain control of South Vietnam, but like it got really close there for a second. There were, a few times throughout this large battle, or large battles, I guess I should say, when it seemed likely that like North Vietnam was going to win this. They were going to be able to defeat the South Vietnamese and defeat the Americans, and like this was going to be the end. So yes, we were able to hold them off, but this is the moment that a lot of Americans are like, oh crap, like this is not good. We are not doing as well as we think we've been doing in Vietnam. Remember that when we talked about the pro-war movement, all of the justifications that people had for fighting in Vietnam, all of them, I said in class, rested on the credibility factor. The fact that Americans believed what their government was telling them was true. And this is the moment when that starts to fall apart. Americans start to feel like maybe what the government had been telling them wasn't quite true. We talked about Johnson and his policy of minimum candor, the fact that he always wanted to either spin the information about Vietnam in a positive way or to kind of limit the flow of information. So Americans were under maybe the assumption that like, oh yeah, our military is the best, of course, we're of course going to do well. This is the moment when that's starting to fall apart. Americans are starting to realize we are not winning this war in Vietnam. We've been there now for like 4.5 years in terms of military. And like, why isn't this working? And so that's the beginning of what we would call the credibility gap. And the real moment where this falls apart is when Walter Cronkite on TV kind of drops this line where he basically is like, I don't know that I believe what's going on anymore. I don't know if we can win this anymore. And the reason why this is a big deal is Walter Cronkite was one of the most sort of famous and well-respected and well-known TV news anchors. People generally like believed what he said. And in 1968, after the Tet Offensive, he essentially says on live TV, this reporter can't be too sure that we are winning the war in Vietnam. And so a lot of Americans, like, that was the final straw. When Walter Cronkite didn't believe what the government was telling them anymore, like, neither did they. I'm not sure if this video will work during my screen recording, so I'm not going to press it, but please watch this on your own to get a better sense of what exactly he said. I'm just giving you the summary, but what he actually says is a lot more impactful and detailed. And so this really represents what a lot of Americans were feeling in 1968, that they'd been fed basically a whole bunch of lies about Vietnam, and so they really start to distrust the government. So that's actually where we're going to stop with this little mini lecture. I'll be jumping back on to talk about the end of the war, Nixon's presidency, and his Vietnamization strategy in a bit. So thanks, and yeah, that's it.